Thank you. So I'm going to talk a bit today about my particular contribution to the open source movement, namely the Debian distribution of Linux. And I appreciate the glowing introduction. I hope I've earned it. I feel like I'm just one member of a larger community. This happens to be my contribution. And thousands of others have made similarly important contributions. And hopefully many of you will be inspired by this week to go on and make your own contributions. That's how all of this works. So let me start out by introducing myself. I have been using Linux, developing on Linux and in Linux, and advocating Linux free software and the open source development model since 1993, so over 10 years. This was only slightly after Linux itself got started. That was in 1991. So this is one area in which I can call myself an old-timer. I've been around since nearly the beginning, and it's been an incredible experience to watch Linux grow from a few people, handfuls and pockets of students in universities around the world, but primarily in the US and Europe, into this global movement, which is now generating billions of dollars of revenue for global companies, and which is affecting all parts of the world in many different aspects, economically, societally, philosophically, politically, you name it. Of course, I founded the Debian distribution. That was my initial contribution, hopefully not my only contribution. And you'll notice that I started that project very shortly after I started using Linux itself. And there's a very good reason for that. And in fact, a large part of this talk is an explanation of why that is so. More recently, I founded a company called Progeny. I am now the chairman and chief strategist of Progeny. Progeny got started a little over 4 years ago in the height of the .com era. It was very easy to raise money during this time and very difficult to fail because there was so much money floating around. Fortunately, we have survived the collapse of the .com era, and hopefully we've learned a little bit about how to build a business around Linux. Those of you who were here yesterday and heard me make comments about how to build a business around Linux and open source software know that there are a unique set of challenges to selling software when the software itself is typically free of charge. And we think we've stumbled on to a winning formula at Progeny, but time will tell. Okay, so here is the obligatory Linux accomplishment slide. And this is very well known, probably to most of you. Linux is currently the second most popular operating system on servers worldwide. Second only to, of course, Windows, Microsoft Windows. In terms of the traditional market analysis metrics, Linux has 25 to 30% of the market, Windows with roughly 35 or 40%, and the rest divided between Unix and NetWare. And of course, I always point out when I talk about these numbers that these are probably conservative, because in this particular case, IDC only counts units that were paid for. So units that were shipped in a box or with an IBM or Hewlett-Packard computer. It doesn't count all of the scores of copies that get downloaded every day for free from the FTP servers and the web. So the actual number is likely much larger than this. Tens of millions of users worldwide. There's really no way of knowing how many exactly because of the fact that you can download it for free. You don't have to buy it. You don't have to have a license to use it. And I think most importantly, over the last several years, we have seen support from virtually every major player in the technology industry. Of course, IBM and HP, Sun, Intel, Novell. These are just a handful of names. And I also like to point out here that even companies that are not supportive of Linux clearly have a Linux strategy. Microsoft itself has called Linux its #1 threat. And it is, if you look at the actions that it is taking recently, you'll see that it is positioning itself to be competitive with Linux as we go forward here. Okay, now here we get to the more interesting stuff, hopefully the areas where I can provide some insight. How did this happen? How did we go from being a handful of students with no particular plan, simply developing code and giving it to each other? How did we get from there to here, to where we're Microsoft's #1 threat and IBM's arguably #1, I'm sorry, did I say Microsoft's #1 friend? Microsoft's #1 enemy, and arguably IBM's #1 friend. My first assertion is it's not the technology that got us here. In fact, if you take a look at it, it's just Unix. Linux is just another implementation of Unix. There's really nothing that groundbreaking about it. And for those of us who found Linux early on, it was the technology that drew us because we were in the university environment, the computer science environment largely, and Unix was very popular in these environments. And so we were looking for an operating system that we already knew how to use, but one that we could afford, because Unix at the time was very unaffordable. And the Microsoft operating systems were not very good. So we were looking for something that was good and affordable. This has been a theme here the past day or so. One of the most obvious benefits of Linux and other open source software is the fact that it's free. And this is particularly important to those of us who were students and had no money, as I'm sure many of you can relate to a little too well. So the fact that we could get it without having to pay for it was extremely important, because otherwise we wouldn't have been able to get it. The fact that the source was available, it wasn't just freeware in the typical sense at the time, where you could download it from the internet without paying for it. We got more than just the executable version of the program. We got the underlying source code that governed how that program worked, which meant that we could study it. We were computer science students, so this was particularly interesting to us. We could look at real software that people were using in the real world and see how it worked. It wasn't just an example or a prototype. And then, once we got comfortable with how it worked, we could change it. We could experiment. We could make it do things that it hadn't originally been designed to do, but that we needed it to do. We could share those changes with our fellow students and enthusiasts so that, hey, you know, I've made this change to this program that I find useful. You've made this change to this other program that you find useful. Let's just share them. That was extremely important as well. If it had just been the program that ran on the computer that we got for free, this never would have gone anywhere. The fact that we could extend the software and share those extensions with each other was critical. The third reason, the third crucial attribute that got us from here to there, or from there to here, is the fact that we formed a community. We were able to form a community because we had the source code and we could share the changes that we made. And so very quickly, Linux in particular became about more than just the software. It was about the fact that when you downloaded Linux and you started using it, you suddenly became part of a larger community. You weren't buying a product from a commercial vendor where if you had trouble with it, you had to call between the hours of 9 and 5 between Monday and Friday to get help, there was a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week community available to you that you could turn to for help, that you could share your changes with, and they could share their changes with you. And that was extremely important because that's what made it interesting. We were actually forming a sort of a mini society around the software and the idea of how to build it. The fourth reason, Unix compatibility. I alluded to this in the very first point, which was the fact that Linux was something that was recognizable to us, that we understood and knew how to use. This lowered the barrier to a lot of us who already knew Unix, who were in fact looking for a Unix that we could afford. I don't know that this is as important as the other, the preceding three. Had Linux been something completely new, or had Linux been an implementation of VMS or some other operating system, we might still be talking today. But clearly at the time, the early Linux adopters and enthusiasts knew Unix. And finally, the industry validation that's happened over the last few years has also been extremely important. So for a long time, Linux was a technology that a lot of people had heard of. A lot of people maybe even knew something about it, but everyone was afraid to try it because no one really knew how viable it was in a production or commercial environment. There were exceptions, but the old adage in the computer business has always been nobody gets fired for buying IBM. And so when IBM starts selling Linux and advocating Linux, and other companies start selling and advocating Linux, suddenly it becomes viable. It's no longer the risk that it used to be. And you see the same kinds of things with the early adopters. I mean, this kind of thing is extremely important because no one wants to be first, because there is a certain risk to being first. And so once you get over that hump, things become a lot easier, and things begin to steamroll as they did here. And then the last one, this is my favorite one, and it's probably the biggest reason of all. With any success in any endeavor, there's a certain amount of luck to it, right? In a way, Linux was in the right place at the right time. The Unix vendors were fighting each other. It wasn't clear where the Unix industry was going to go. Microsoft was moving in to fill this void that the Unix vendors were leaving as they fought each other. There was a very real sense that Unix was going to be left behind and Windows was going to move in and take over everything, not just the desktop, but the server too. People were getting tired of the proprietary software model, which implied that you bought a product from someone and you were beholden to that someone to get support and the assistance that you needed to make use of it. And so Linux came along. It had everything that such a alternative solution needed to have, and people adopted it in droves. And it's kind of interesting if you think about it, and I'm sure that Richard Stallman will talk a bit about this tomorrow. But in a way, Linux was the last piece of the GNU system that he and the Free Software Foundation had been building for 6 or 7 years at that time. And so Linux truly did come at the right place and the right time. They didn't have to write all of the utilities and the compiler and the debugger and the editors and everything else to form a complete system. They were able to fill that missing gap to create a complete system. Okay. So, First, let me start off by telling you how I found Linux. So I was looking for a Unix. It was primarily motivated by the fact that it was winter, and I was going to school in a cold place, and I didn't want to walk across campus every time I needed to do my programming assignments. So I got on the Usenet one day, and I started looking around for some software that would allow me to connect into the Unix computers from home. And sure enough, I found this thing called Linux, and it implied that I had to do a lot of very frightening sounding things like partition my hard disk, do all sorts of things that I'd never done before, but I decided, you know, what the heck, I'll give it a shot. So I downloaded it. I started tinkering around with it. Pretty soon I had Unix on my lowly PC at home. And so initially it was the wonder of the fact that I have this Unix. I finally have my own Unix at home. But pretty soon it starts to settle in that, okay, I have my own Unix at home, and I just downloaded it for free. How exactly did this happen? So on the face of it, and this was, think back 10 years, I mean, open source is pretty well known these days, even among the general population. But 10 years ago, it made no sense. The fact that these people from around the world who didn't know each other, for the most part, who weren't getting paid to do this, who really had no master plan, had come together seemingly at random and created an operating system that actually worked. That was free. And it took me a while to wrap my head around this. It defied all logic to me. And what quickly became apparent to me was, as I said on a previous slide, it wasn't the technology that was particularly interesting. It was at first, because I'd been using Unix for years, and now I had a Unix. I could become root, and I could erase my entire disk. And, you know, there was this sort of barrier that you were never able to cross in the multi-user time-sharing days. And now suddenly I was able to cross it. And that was initially quite a novel thing. But I kept going back to this amazement here. How did all this happen? And it became clear to me very quickly that it was the development model that made it happen. It wasn't the technology. The fact that people were able to form a community and communicate with each other and work toward common goals, even when those common goals weren't clearly articulated, or even when those common goals didn't have the profit motive behind them. It was the development model that allowed it. I was swept up by the community. The fact that I was not only using a piece of software, but the fact that there were hundreds and thousands of other people just like me down the road and in places like Turkey who were seeing the same things that I was seeing and swept up by the same things that I was swept up by. That's what really grabbed me. So it was as I said numerous times yesterday, it was the freeness of the software, the freeness as in cost, that got me. It was the community that kept me. And once you join a community and you realize how much you are getting from that community, one of your natural reactions is to wonder, what can I do for that community? What can I do to give back to it, to this community that has given so much to me and who doesn't even know me? And my answer to that was Debian. So at the time, this was before any of the commercial distributions existed, so before Red Hat existed as a company, before SUSE existed as a company. And the way you installed Linux was largely you got a couple of floppy diskette images and you bootstrapped your system in a very painful way. You downloaded all the source. You built everything yourself. And this was an acceptable way of installing Linux for people like me, because I was a computer science student. I was an enthusiast. I was willing to put up with all kinds of pain to get my own free Unix. But I saw in the development model a way that basically Linux did not necessarily need to be limited to this group of enthusiasts that had created it. The thing that was really standing in the way was creating a complete package that a businessman or a school teacher could install without having to even know what a compiler was. So I set out to build a distribution, a collection of software, free software, open source software, like the GNU utilities and the GNU compiler, the X Window system, combining them with the kernel, the Linux kernel, to create an operating system that you could install in a way very similar to MS-DOS or to any other operating system that someone might use. And of course, we had to fill gaps. We had to write a program that would install all of that software onto your computer. We had to figure out how to manage the software that was on the computer. We had to write all kinds of utilities that hadn't really been needed before, because you didn't have to worry about how to manage this kind of a situation. So that's how Debian came about, in a few words. And here's the formal definition of a distribution for those of you who the term is, you're unfamiliar with the term. It is actually an interesting term for people who come from the traditional operating system world, because an operating system is a monolithic whole, traditionally. It's a kernel and utilities and graphics desktop system and maybe even web browser, media player, various other things, depending on who you are. Linux is a collection of independently developed software. So Linux is a kernel, and you have GNU software, and you have Apache web server, which is developed by a completely independent group. You have Java technologies that are open source. You have OpenOffice. You have huge collections of software. The role of the distribution is to take all of those technologies, to integrate them together into a cohesive whole that is approachable to the masses that see an operating system as a single unit. So Debian was one of the first Linux distributions, started, as I've said, about 10 years ago. There were a few distributions that preceded it. Slackware is the only one that's still around, preceded Debian by a couple of months. But I like to say that Debian was the first modern distribution, because it was the first distribution that supported the distribution of software in a modular form, in a form that's very similar to the way the constituent elements of the distribution are themselves managed. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Debian was also a very early example of the open development model, or open source development model, in action. And I think it's probably the first example of a project that set out intentionally to be developed as an open process. So Linux was developed as an open process, but that was largely an accident. Linus wrote some code and put it on the web, and people started sending him patches, and pretty soon this open development community emerged around it. With Debian, we actually set out intentionally to do it that way, and I think that was a pretty major milestone. And in my view, this is Debian's biggest achievement. Debian is a great distribution. Millions of people use it, but it also showed that the open development model was workable, because in the beginning people really didn't know if it was going to work. It seemed like an invitation to disaster, that you're going to try to build something as enormous as an entire operating system distribution by getting a random group of people together and saying, all right, let's go build it. So before I talk about the mechanics of how all this worked, let me provide an overview here of where Debian is today. So Debian today is actually 1,100 plus developers at this point. I need to update my slides. Millions of users around the world. Second only to, in the commercial space anyway, Red Hat Linux, or in the US in popularity. I like to refer to a Netcraft survey. Netcraft is an internet-based, does internet-based research. And they call Debian the most cosmopolitan of all Linux distributions because while Red Hat is very dominant in the United States and SUSE is very dominant in Germany and other parts of Europe, and certain distributions are dominant in places like Brazil and Asia Pacific, Debian has a pretty strong presence just about everywhere. And I think that's because of the community around it and the fact that it is an open process. People are not just accepting a product from someone, from a U.S. company or a German company, or even a German nonprofit entity. They are becoming part of a community, and they are positioning themselves to build their own local communities, and from local communities emerge local industries. And that's why I think Debian is so popular in so many places, because people are thinking locally. It is a nonprofit open source project. There's never been a company around it. But it has been the basis of many commercial products, probably most famously Corel's Linux, which came out in the late 90s. And the open source definition itself, which is the definition of the term open source, was originally a Debian position statement called the Debian Free Software Guidelines, which is written by a guy named Bruce Parents, who was a Debian project leader at the time. So it has clearly had a pretty broad impact, not just in the fact that a lot of people are using it, but in that it has shown a model of developing software that actually works and that's quite novel, and it has all kinds of very beneficial side effects, such as fostering local communities and industries. All right, how did Debian get started? All right, at the time, 10 years ago, kind of hard to picture, even for me at this point, there was a distribution called SLS, which stood for Soft Landing Linux System, if I remember right. And SLS was a very important project in its own right, because SLS was the first distribution to attempt to aggregate together a large number of, large collection of software. And in particular, software that ordinary users outside of the development community would find useful, things like word processors and graphic systems and these sorts of things. The problem was that SLS was done by one guy, and a distribution is an enormous thing. And so as I was using SLS and discovering problem after problem, I began to think, you know, maybe the problem here isn't so much SLS, but the way that SLS has been developed. So let me point out before I go on any further that SLS had an enormous contribution to the evolution of Linux. It opened the door for an enormous number of Linux users. Suddenly people didn't necessarily have to go through that pain that I described earlier to become a Linux user, downloading the core and compiling everything else. They could get a reasonably complete operating system that was reasonably easy to install at the time and have Linux. The problem was that the end result was less than ideal. So the end system was very rough around the edges. The end system had a lot of problems, and My worry was that Linux has an enormous amount of potential. How many bad first impressions is SLS leaving with potential Linux users? Are people going to download SLS and install it and take a look at it and think, this is Linux, and it isn't particularly good, and then move on to something else? So first and foremost, Debian was an attempt to create a better distribution. And that was to be my contribution to the Linux community, to basically continue what SLS started, to continue opening the door for new Linux users, but to do so in a way that learned from the mistakes of SLS and, in the end, had a better result. Okay, so let me share with you some of my early observations about SLS. As I said earlier, one of the biggest problems from my point of view was that SLS was done by a single person. And the guy was overloaded. As SLS became popular, he couldn't keep up with all the bug reports. He couldn't keep up with all the feature requests. He couldn't possibly use all of the software that he was putting into his system. I remember Emacs, which was my editor of choice, out of the box in one of the SLS releases just didn't work because he was a VI user. In another release, there was for those of you who use Linux, the swap partition was linked to dev HDA1 by default, which was the way it was on his system. But unfortunately, on most people's systems, that was their DOS partition. And so when the thing booted for the first time, it would erase their DOS partition. So these are the sorts of bad impressions that I'm talking about. To my mind, it was the one guy who was doing it. And not him in particular, but the fact that there was only one of him. So we decided very early that we would open the Debian development process to avoid precisely this particular problem. Anyone can participate. And in Eric Raymond's terms, this is cathedral versus the bazaar approach. Of course, he didn't coin those terms until many years later, but I think this is sort of the classic example of the single person slaving away on his own versus the open process that anyone can come in and participate. And people can leave as well. People come, people go, but in the steady state, it's a sustainable process. And in fact, at the time, the cathedral bazaar terminology hadn't been used yet, and so we simply referred to the model we were using as the Linux development process, because we were attempting to recreate what had emerged from the development of Linux, namely that anyone could get involved, anyone could contribute. Okay, so let me say a few words about how Debian worked, because once we decided that the main problem with SLS was the fact that it was one guy, we were going to do it as a community, an open community where anyone can get involved. There are a lot of problems, there are a lot of potential problems that fall out of that. You're talking about an enormous task, building an entire operating system, and potentially trying to coordinate the actions of dozens of people, hundreds of people maybe, and now thousands of people who more than likely don't speak the same language, aren't getting paid, all the things I said earlier. So the main question was, how do you subdivide the work of building an entire operating system? And so what we decided to do was to divide the work into discrete, self-contained pieces, which we called packages. So I said earlier that a Linux distribution is really a collection of software from a whole bunch of places. And each of those places is a discrete thing. Apache, Emacs, GNU shell utilities, GNU C compiler. And so we thought, why not split the distribution up among its constituent elements? So the idea is that each developer in the project could then take responsibility for one or more of those units. And we were very careful to specify how each of these units were to interact with each other. So we created a set of standards and a set of guidelines which said, if you want to develop a software package for Debian, here is how you do it. Here's the format in which the software is delivered to the system. If you want to start something at boot time, you put a script here. If you need the functionality of another package, you can depend on that package so that the system will not let you install that package unless the other package is also installed. And so a lot of these things should be familiar to Linux users because they're now prevalent in virtually every Linux distribution. It turned out to be a pretty good way of distributing software. But initially, the package system came to Linux as a way to facilitate this kind of distributed development. How do you subdivide the work of building an operating system? Okay, why did Debian work? Did I miss a slide there? Okay. Why Debian worked? Okay. So Debian did work, thankfully. The idea of a package worked. The idea of having standards to hold these packages together worked. But it was more to it than that. Because people showed up. I sent the announcement out in fall of 1993, and very shortly thereafter, I started getting emails from all kinds of people saying, you know what, I've been thinking about this very same problem. I've been using SLS for 6 months, and I'm not particularly happy with it. I've been thinking about building my own distribution, but I don't have the time, or I don't have the expertise. And we like this idea of kind of working together to build a better distribution. So Debian, first and foremost, addressed a widely acknowledged problem. And this is a key component to success. And by the way, another title for the slide could be How to Make an Open Source Project Work. If an open source project does not have all of these features to it, it's not going to work. So Debian, first and foremost, solved a problem that a lot of people were experiencing. And so it caused them to want to help. The second thing that Debian did is there was a clearly articulated vision behind it. So you see a lot of open source projects. You can go to SourceForge, for instance, and look at any 5 or 10 projects, and you'll probably see 4 or 9 of them that are nothing because someone shows up and says, you know, I think I'm going to do an open source project to do X, Y, Z. And it may be, you know, a lot of people may say, well, yeah, you know, that's a good idea. I'd really like to contribute to that. But if simply stating the problem isn't enough, you have to formulate at least an initial solution. Because otherwise people show up ready to contribute their time and other things, and they don't know how to do it. So the second thing that you've got to do if you want to build a successful open source project is to think about the problem, formulate an initial solution, and articulate that solution to the people who show up to contribute to it. The third thing, the open culture and community around Debian. The fact that we were open in every way that we could possibly be open. Our mailing lists were open. Our bug tracking system was open. So users could follow along. They could observe without feeling like they would potentially embarrass themselves by not knowing how to do particular things. And they could observe until they felt comfortable with contributing and with sticking their neck out and becoming more active and involved. This also led to a spirit of community, which has held the Debian project together very strongly since the beginning. And in fact, as I travel around the world and I meet Debian developers, there is no stronger bond in the open source world that I've ever seen stronger than Debian. And Debian developers are a community, and that has contributed enormously to its success. The fourth thing that Debian did right, and this is where, by the way, most open source projects go wrong: infrastructure. So, going back to the SourceForge example, a lot of people decide, I'm going to do an open source project, and maybe they even have a pretty good idea about how they're going to do it, how they're going to solve the problem, and they're able to clearly articulate that. They're open. You know, they go to SourceForge, they create a project, they have open mailing lists, they talk and talk and talk about what they're going to do, but nothing ever happens. Because in the end, if someone wants to contribute to an open source project, there has to be a starting point of some sort. You can't simply say, I think we should go do this, and expect everyone to go do it. So in Debian's case, even though we had the open culture and community, even though we were building to the point where we were going to develop this in a distributed fashion, we also knew that we had to build the infrastructure that would allow all of these people to come together and collaborate. So we needed a package system to take all of these units that the individual developers were building and hold them together in some cohesive way. We needed standards that made sure that when you took all of these independently developed packages, they all fit together and looked like a single system and not some hodgepodge of software. And we even built the first few releases. I say we, because I'm so used to saying we. I built the first few releases myself, because I knew that our infrastructure in the beginning was not yet ready to support the distributed development. And in fact, it was 6 months before, or maybe even more than that, before we had enough infrastructure in place to where we were actually able to flip the switch and say, okay, now we're going to do it. And I think it was because of that initial investment in building the foundation, that was a critical component of making Debian a success. Because when people showed up, when people were attracted by the widely acknowledged problem, when people bought into the clearly articulated vision, when people were able to participate in the open culture and community and then go from observer to participant, once they got to that point, they already knew how they could contribute, whether it was a missing piece of software that they needed, whether it was a particular configuration of an existing piece of software they could contribute. They already knew, because they had already been using the system, they had already been observing the process and community. The fifth thing is leadership. Every open source project has to have a strong leader. And that's because nothing happens by consensus. If you have a group of people and you decide to do something and you're not clear on what that something is, nothing is ever going to happen. So even to this day, even though Debian is a large community, it still has a leader. It still has a structure to it, so that decisions can be made. There is a consensus building process. Even when I ran the project without the current democratic foundation that's been built since then, I would go out when a decision had to be made. I would ask the developers, we have to make a decision. What do you think we should do? I would listen to the feedback, and I'd ultimately make a decision. A lot of times, the decision was in line with the majority, but it often wasn't. So you have to have strong leadership. You see this, and think about all of the open source projects that have been truly breakout successes. Linux, you've got Linus Torvalds. With Apache, you've got Brian Behlendorf. With GNOME, you've got Miguel de Casa. I mean, you can typically think of a single person that comes to mind when you think of any one of these highly successful open source projects. And there is a reason for that. The last thing is critical mass. This is the point when the open source project that you've created starts to take on a life of its own. So this is the point at which you can step away from it and know that it's going to keep going. Because you have attracted enough developers to your project, because you have the open culture and community that allows the project to sustain itself beyond the founder's time, because you have the infrastructure in place that allows the people who show up to contribute to it, your project reaches a point where it is literally unstoppable. In fact, I stepped down as the Debian leader in 1996, which was 8 years ago, 7 years ago. And Debian not only continues to survive, it's thriving. It's doing better than ever, and it continues to do better than ever, year after year. That's because it has taken on a life of its own. And something that I realized that it had reached critical mass. I wasn't quite sure, but I realized when I did step away from the project, which ultimately was to give me more time to finish my degree at school, which I had largely been neglecting as a result of this. I stepped away from it, and everything kept going. And I knew then that Debian was a success. And something that Bruce Perrins told me a few years later. Bruce Perrins succeeded me as the Debian project leader and has gone on to be a very famous person in the open source movement. He said, you know, I don't think I could kill Debian now if I wanted to, because it's just so much bigger than any individual person. Okay, what were the main contributions that Debian brought to the open source world and to the larger world? As I said earlier, I think the most important contribution is the community-based development model that Debian employed. I think that before Debian, the Linux development model was largely viewed as a curiosity. No one was really sure why it worked, just that it did work. And in fact, when I announced that I was going to be building Debian in very much the same way, most people told me that it wouldn't work. Because how could you possibly get all of these people together on the same page working toward a common goal? It's just not going to work. And I think what Debian did more than anything is show that it does work, that it can work. And, you know, don't get me wrong, Debian has its share of problems. It has difficulty making decisions. It's slow to get releases out. It becomes, certain things in the culture have become so ingrained that even though for the betterment of the larger Linux world, they might change some of that culture, it's not going to happen. But there are problems in everything that we do. And Debian is certainly no exception. It does work. That's the key thing. The second thing, technologically, the biggest contribution that Debian made was to introduce the concept of package management to the Linux world. And package management is now, of course, a central part of any distribution, whether it's RPM with Red Hat or dpackage with Debian-based distributions. And in fact, it's ironic if you think about it, in that the non-commercial Debian introduced the technology that would ultimately go on to be one of the leading commercialization enablers. Red Hat, SUSE, these guys largely sell package updates, which is made possible by the fact that the distribution is a discrete set of packages. So I take some amount of pleasure in that. Another emphasis, or another contribution, is Debian's emphasis on project management and infrastructure. So that should be pretty clear from the preceding slide. We spent a lot of time thinking about this. We spent a lot of time building this to make sure that all of this collaboration and communication could work. And I think before then it was Linux was largely viewed as an accident. It just kind of happened, which is true. But what Debian did by emphasizing the project management and infrastructure part of building an open source technology, it goes back to number one. The community-based development model can work if you have the proper project management and infrastructure. The other thing I like to talk about, and this is particularly in the US, where Linux has become a huge business. I mean, companies are making multiple billions of dollars from Linux today. And even the older companies like Red Hat are starting to move more in the direction of their proprietary predecessors. So it's come up a couple of times here, Red Hat's discontinuation of Red Hat Linux. And this caused a lot of pain to a lot of people. And the primary reason that they did it is to move people to their more commercial proprietary solution. And one of the things that Debian provides is this constant glimpse into what the Linux world was like in the early days. So Debian is very much a snapshot of 1993, and what the world was like, what the Linux world was like in 1993, which I contend is the very reason that Linux has been a success. So as we move into the commercialization phase of Linux, Debian is a constant reminder that we have to preserve this Linux ecosystem going forward. Otherwise, Linux just becomes another commercial operating system. And if it becomes just another commercial operating system, then what good is it? Do you want to use a Red Hat product or a SUSE product or a Microsoft product? I mean, what's the difference between all of those things if all you're buying is a product and if you're not becoming part of a community? All right, one question I always get asked is, where do you think Debian's going to go? I don't know any more than anyone else, but because I stand up in front of lots of people and talk about it, I hopefully get to influence it a little bit by suggesting things. So as I just said, the commercialization of Linux is very much at a crossroads here. There is this perplexing question that's been asked a couple of times already this week. How do you make money when software is free? And companies like Red Hat are faced with this very problem, and they have their own set of answers, which frankly I think are wrong. They're trying to package Linux as a product. They are trying to lock in users the same way that Microsoft locks in users, albeit by different methods, by their branding and their ISV relationships, not by their intellectual property, but the end result is the same. So I think that this is very much the same crossroads that Unix found itself 10 years ago, right? Going full circle here. Linux happened because Unix destroyed itself. And we have to make sure that the same thing doesn't happen to Linux. And to the extent that these companies are trying to own Linux for themselves, that's exactly what all of the Unix vendors were trying to do 10 years ago. So the Linux ecosystem is very much at stake here. If Linux is just another product, why is it interesting? Good question. Will one product, or will any one company own Linux? Will Linux become just another commercial product? As the world's leading community-driven distribution, my contention is that Debian can and should lead the way. It's been a preserver of the ecosystem for the past 10 years. In fact, it got started in a way to preserve that ecosystem 10 years ago as Linux was beginning to be commercialized in a very small way. It should continue to play that role going forward. And that concludes my talk. I can take any questions.
I want to ask a question about the future of distributions. Do you think the distribution market is matured enough to become a commodity market, or do you think are there any new things that can be done there? And if you think the latter one is correct, and if you were in a position to form a new distribution other than Debian, what will be your priorities? Where will you attack first? And I must add that this question comes from a group which is working on a new distribution itself.
Okay.
Thanks.
It's my view that the Linux distribution market is a commodity market. I think that part of the problem is that Red Hat and SUSE and the other distribution vendors find themselves selling a commodity product, which is not something you ever really want to find yourself selling, because it's kind of like, how do you sell toilet paper? I mean, there's only so many features that you can advertise. It becomes a branding exercise, and it becomes a very expensive and difficult thing to sell, and a difficult competitive position to maintain over time. And so that's why you see Red Hat and these other companies increasingly trying to position their own Linux as the one true Linux. And I think that's a very dangerous thing, because the very reason that Linux is interesting is because it isn't owned by any company. It's owned by the community of developers who built it. And sure, there are companies that build commercial distributions, and that benefits all of us. It goes back to if Linux is a commons, are people giving back to the commons in addition to taking from it? And in terms of building new distributions, actually my company, Progeny, is in the business of building specialized distributions for companies. And so we think of ourselves as a distribution company that embraces the fact that the distribution is a commodity product. What we do is, if a company needs to use Linux in a particular way, whether it's in some product as an invisible part of it, or whether they want to customize the way the desktop gets deployed in their particular organization, whether they want to run it on a very small device or a very large device, that's where I think the value comes in the distribution world. So there are plenty of room. There is plenty of room for new distributions as long as they focus on innovating in areas that allow value to be built above the distribution, above the commodity layer.